get moving. So good morning, everyone. My name is Joe Rossi, working with the South Shore CRS Users Group, and we have Shannon Holst here from the Cape Cod CRS Users Group, and this is a combined meeting. We figured in the virtual world, this is probably the best way to get everybody together for a really good training that we're so lucky to have the presenters here that we have today. So before we dive into our presentations, I'm actually going to ask each one of the guests to go ahead and introduce themselves. And I'm going to actually, Shannon and I will have a chance to do that here. So I'm going to skip over Shannon and go to Joy.
Hi, Joe and Shannon. Thanks so much for having us here today. So I work for the Department of Conservation and Recreation for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And in that big agency, there's a little teeny office called the Flood Hazard Management Program Office, and it's staffed by Eric Carlson and myself. And I fill the role of the state NFIP coordinator there. Thanks.
Eric.
Thank you, Joe. I'm Eric Carlson, and as Joy mentioned, I work for DCR Flood Hazard Management Program, and I'm an engineer with that program.
Great. Go to Gene.
Yeah, good morning. I'm sorry, my video feed doesn't seem to be working, but I am the ISO field representative for New England, and I was New York, but no longer, so I can focus on New England communities. And I still have Puerto Rico, so that gives me a little respite from the New England towns. Thanks.
I bet you'd much rather be in Puerto Rico this time of year than New England.
You know, it's funny, the one community in Puerto Rico had their cycle visit last year, and of course, I didn't get to go.
Oh, well.
Oh, well.
Hoping for the next time, exactly.
Right.
All right, I'm going to go to Molly.
Hi, I'm Molly Caput. I'm the Senior Floodplain Management Specialist at FEMA Region 1, and I'm also the CRS Coordinator for FEMA Region 1, so communications about FEMA side of CRS stuff come to me.
Great. Katie.
Good morning. My name is Katie Rand. I work for FEMA Region 1 as an emergency management specialist. I'm also the point of contact for Massachusetts and the deputy CRS coordinator.
Awesome. And John.
Hi, I am John Grace from FEMA Region 1 as well. I'm also an emergency management specialist and work with Katie and Molly. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So for those on the call, we have a all-star panel here, both the presenters and those able to answer any questions that you have during the day. As I mentioned, just some housekeeping items before we dig in. This is set up as a webinar, so guests have the ability to access the chat and Q&A features in Zoom. So we ask that you utilize those. We may have an opportunity at the end to unmute certain people if they raise their hand to ask verbal questions, but we're going to be going through things today in a way that will be much better for you to type your questions. Shannon will be monitoring the Q&A and chat. So if you could put your questions there, we have a plan to break about 15 slides in to answer the first set of questions. And then at the end, we'll answer any remaining questions or dig in to any questions that may have come up that require a little bit more technical assistance. So thank you for that. And with that, I am just going to go into a quick overview of today's agenda. So, of course, my name Joe Rossi, as I mentioned, with the Massachusetts Coastal Coalition, with the South Shore CRS Users Group. And then in a second, I'll have Shannon introduce herself and her role with Barnstable County. We're then going to dive into the training today, both with Joy and Eric on letters of map change. And you can see that we're going to be talking about a review of LOMC options, things such as how FEMA might help to develop a BFE in an unnumbered A zone. And just a reminder, this is not a technical presentation about how to file a LOMA or LOMAR or LOMC. Then we're going to get some CRS updates from Jean, our ISO CRS specialist, and then we'll take kind of what we learned today and do a closing and action item, including talking about when we may meet next. So with that, I'm going to throw it over to Shannon.
All right, thanks, Joe. My name is Shannon Hulst. As Joe said, I am the floodplain specialist and community rating system coordinator for Barnstable County through the Cape Cod Cooperative Extension and Woods Hole Sea grant. So Joe and I each have these user groups, and we are thrilled that we could offer this as a joint user group and offer this training together, since we are able to bring everyone together in this virtual platform. So thank you for joining us. I will make a note with the CFM and CBO credits. If you have registered and you signed off that you were you wanted those credits, we've got that information, and I'm keeping track of who is actually here with us today, and then I will submit that. So you won't have to do anything. If you do find that it's not showing up in your records, feel free to reach out to me, or if you have Joe's information, reach out to Joe and he'll pass you on to me, and we'll make sure that we get that sorted out. And I mentioned earlier, but we do have two folks on the phone. You should have either my or Joe's contact information. So if you could just let us know who you are, if you want those credits, and we'll make sure you get them. Joe, back to you.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much, Shannon. Thank you also for being the question and answer and chat watcher today, because we're going to have probably a lot. And I appreciate, we want this to be, even though we're in this, like Shannon said, this virtual world, and it might be a little bit harder to interact. I mean, we wish we were all in person doing this, but please utilize those tools that you have in Zoom to chat with us, to ask questions. And as I mentioned, if we have time at the end, and we do have a full agenda today, we may be able to unmute certain people if they have questions, raise your hand and we can unmute you and at the end and answer any remaining questions. But we do want to utilize that chat in Q&A. So with all that being said, in an introduction from everybody, we're going to dive right in, and I want to introduce today the presentation by both Joy and Eric. We already got introductions from them, so I'm going to allow them to dig right in. So let me get rid of my screen here. Hold on one second. Okay. So Joy, I think you are good to go. Awesome.
Can you see it?
Yep, we see it.
Are you looking at the right thing?
We are looking at the right thing.
Okay. All right. So again, thanks all of you for letting us talk to you today about letters of map change. I have the easy part. I'm doing the first, I don't know, dozen slides or so, just sort of a high level look at what letters of map change are. So if you already know all this, just hang in there, because Eric has the meat in the second half. But just an overview of what letters of map change are out there for people to be able to use, where you find records of those and so forth, and just talking about, letters of map change in general. So let me, oops, all right, let's see. Okay, so this is just sort of a graphic of some part of a FEMA flood insurance rate map. As you know, these are updated as often as FEMA can keep up with it, as often as they have funding, and as often as development begins to impose significant changes possibly on the floodplain. The maps, as we all know, are not always accurate. And so letters of map change are a way to acknowledge discrepancies on existing maps. So when a property owner wants to sort of argue, if you will, about whether or not their site or their structure is in the floodplain, then for a parcel like that, one parcel, a small piece of the map, they would probably, in most cases, use a letter of map amendment. And as you probably know, the letter of map amendment does not change the map. It's simply a letter of determination from FEMA that FEMA agrees that this property or this structure is not in the floodplain to some extent. And so property owners who get a letter like that need to hang on to that thing. Over time, they may find there's multiple uses for that. With regard to a letter of map revision, Those are things that actually do, as the title suggests, revise the maps. And so when a letter of map revision is given by FEMA, usually once that is a final determination is made, then usually within a few weeks, if you go to the National Flood Hazard Layer in the Map Service Center, you will see that revision has been made to the map. So I'm sure you're all very familiar with FEMA's Map Service Center. There's the website for it. You can find lots of map products there, including obviously the flood insurance rate maps and the flood insurance studies. But you can also find the letters of map change for any given panel. So I just want to show you quickly how you find that. Once you get into the FEMA Map Service Center, let's just say you do that by putting in an address. It will give you a piece, a look at, if you will, the map panel, but there's a little place where you can click go to NFHL, which is the National Flood Hazard Layer, and that will take you to a fully digitized version of the map. And I'm not going to take you through that process right now, but if you know where to look in the top right-hand corner, where there's a little pile of layers, a little icon that means data layers, click on that. You can click on LOMA to make sure those are included. And you'll see, as you see in this slide, little purple dots all over the map if there are letters of map amendment on that map panel. Again, because letters of map revision actually change the map itself, it's somewhat rare that you will see a letter of map revision on the National Flood Hazard Layer, unless maybe it's there for some reason and it's not finished being determined, or maybe for some reason they want to show that for a while. And Eric or Molly may know, or John Grace may know why sometimes you do see those. But typically you can find letters of map amendment. And you can see in a community, if you look at your community, where folks are really having a lot of issues with the maps. Often we see clusters of these in unnumbered A zones and around the edges of some of the A zones or B zones, right around the edges, where the map really may not have been, the study may not have been detailed enough. You know, the transects and the those study points that FEMA uses are pretty broad and pretty far apart. So there's often questionable assumptions in the middle of those, between those. If you want to dig any further, if you click on one of the purple dots, you can see a record will show up. In this case, this record is showing page 1 of 6 for that record. And if you click the little arrow here at the top right, you can go through page by page and see. But for this particular letter of map amendment, for example, this record is showing that this is 52 and 54 Webb Street. I don't remember. Oh, in Salem. And then, so the letter of map amendment is for a single lot. And the outcome that FEMA came up with is that the structure is removed from the floodplain, but part of the property still remains in the floodplain. So that's the kind of information you can get if you go into the National Flood Hazard Layer. Sometimes my little button doesn't work to switch these. Let me see. Whoops. Okay. This again is a somewhat rare example of a LOMR. Must be a LOMR in process or something that was maybe in appeal, but you can see this on this map, or maybe I took it from one of the actual letter of map change requests where they do show where the LOMR is going to be, the area that has been modified or revised by whatever technical information the community or the contractor, or in actuality, the community allows to be shown, to be submitted to FEMA. So this is, I believe, Furnace Creek in Quincy. Yeah, Furnace Brook in Quincy, showing a LOMR that's about to change the map. Let's see if I can make it change again. Okay, great. So these are the types of letters of map change. As you can see, there's several different kinds of letters of map amendment. One is just the simple letter of map amendment where the property owner gives the lowest adjacent grade and enough information for FEMA to make a determination. Another is called a letter of map amendment out as shown. And in some cases, we find that if you just simply look at the FEMA firm, you can see that the property is located in the X zone very clearly, not in the floodplain, and maybe for some reason the lender's third-party determination company maybe made a mistake on that one. And so that's a different process, but both of those are free. There's no charge to file for a letter of map amendment. And the community is not really involved in this. They don't need your permission or any information from you to just go straight to FEMA with these. For the letters of map revision, there is a charge because it takes FEMA's time and expertise to go through all of the data that's required to submit a letter of map revision. And so there is a charge for that. These letter of map amendment can be done online by a property owner, but that's not through the LOMC platform. The LOMC platform is only for surveyors and engineers. So, and then letter of map revision, the part that Eric's going to cover is when Phil is involved. So he's going to take that section. So in every case, FEMA requires technical data to back up the request. You can't just make the request. You have to submit information that supports why you think that the map needs to be amended or revised. As you can see listed there, there's some of the things that are needed for letters of map amendment or a letter of map revision. Typically, a letter of map revision requires quite a bit of technological data, H&H study or some other kind of analysis showing what's going to be changing, either why the floodplain is incorrectly shown on FEMA's map or what changes are going to be taking place on the ground that will alter the floodplain. Okay. So again, a letter of map amendment is a letter stating that an existing structure or parcel of land that has not been elevated by fill would not be inundated by the base flood. And that's what a letter of map amendment is. You can see some of the considerations for requesting a letter of map amendment. Okay, here's an example of, let's see. This is an example of a letter of map amendment where the determination was that the structure, which was what was being requested to be analyzed, is not going to be allowed to be removed from the floodplain. And you can see there, I don't know if you can see my little arrow, but obviously at the top circled, it says non-removal. In other words, FEMA says, no, we do not agree. Down here under determination, this box with the bold outline says, what is the outcome? And you have to really watch this because sometimes it says what is removed from the SFHA and sometimes it says what is not removed from the SFHA. And in this case, a non-removal, the structure is not removed from the special flood hazard area. It's in an AE zone. The lowest adjacent grade supplied by the applicant through whatever documentation they had for that is 12.3 feet. And the base flood elevation is 13. So obviously it is still in the special flood hazard area. There's a sample where the property is removed. So again, now it says here what is removed, the structure. And here you can see the lowest adjacent grade is 9.4 feet. And the actual base flood elevation is 6.8 feet. So they find that the structure is in the X zone. Now down here, there's always more notes and sometimes there are attachments. In this case, it says portions remain in the SFHA. So just the structure alone is removed from the floodplain. And this may be good enough for your lender to not require the flood insurance. That's not always true, and it's always up to the lender how they feel about it. But this is what the property owner would give to the bank to say, please don't require me to buy flood insurance. Should they buy flood insurance? Yes, but they may not be required to at this point. Okay, and this is an example of a FEMA ferment where the little red pin here in the middle is a property on the other side of the street from this pond area, from this wetlands area. And you can see obviously that little structure right there at the bottom of that pin is out as shown by the FEMA map. So the applicant would submit this ferment, the official ferment, and they would submit some other documentation showing the actual location of the property. I believe they have to submit a copy of the plat from the town that shows that structure, and also maybe some verbiage from the deed. But it's all clearly instructed on FEMA's website, and we give this information out to folks all the time, so to help them get that. And the result is something like this. When you fill the form out, you want to make sure you tell the applicant to put out as shown really large across the form, so that it's not treated as a different kind of a LOMA, but it's that they just need to look at the ferment and at the documentation of the subdivision plat map or the property deed and the map that has to be supplied. So here's an out as shown determination document from FEMA. And here in the bold box, what is outside is the structure found to be in the X zone. Now down here, it does say portions remain in the SFHA. Personally, looking at that other one, I'm surprised by that, but anyway, this is the result of that application. Okay, so again, a letter of map revision. So letter of map revision is a document that officially revises a portion of the effective NFIP map according to requirements and procedures outlined in Part 65 of the NFIP regulations. A letter of map revision allows FEMA to revise flood hazard information on an NFIP map via a letter without physically revising and reprinting the entire map panel. We're talking in this case, paper maps. So we used to have paper maps, if some of you remember those days, and FEMA did not reprint those paper maps. But with the National Flood Hazard Layer, you can have those LOMers show up as revisions to the map in that digital format. So the LOMers include the revised portion of the map, the affected flood profiles, and the floodway data tables from the flood insurance study as attachments to the letter that FEMA, that is the resulting product FEMA gives. And letters are like physical map revisions in that they're used to change flood risk zones, floodplain and or floodway delineations, flood elevations, and other features of the map. But they're not intended to change the whole map. So the LOMers, like LOMers have a limited scope to them. And primarily intended to change small areas of the map, such as maybe the area where a culvert is being changed, or some other kind of a floodway study has taken place for some other reason. And typically, we want to see those LOMers as changes where they're either correcting the map or where the floodplain is decreasing in elevation. So FEMA charges people who request LOMers a fee for the review of all of the information that has to go with it. And in the case of a letter of revision, it has to be requested through the community, because the community is responsible for the adoption of the maps. So they are responsible for any revisions to the maps too, in the sense of that they have to be aware of these requests, aware of the revisions, and they have to be able to give their input on what they think about it and what they know about it. So the community is involved in those. So this is where Eric is going to take over. I don't know, Joe, if you want to have, if there are any questions at this point. Oh, and also before that, I did neglect to include in this presentation I noticed in your bullet points, it said something about how to get a BFE. You can't always get a BFE in an unnumbered A zone from FEMA, but if someone believes that they are above the base flood and they're in an unnumbered A zone, and they supply the information required for the LOMA, if they ask FEMA if FEMA would provide a base flood elevation, typically what FEMA is going to want to know is, where else did you look for that information? Who else had that? Did USGS have any information that would give us a hint? You know, did you look for at Natural Resources Conservation Services, or is there Mass DOT information available? Is there any other information available? Does the state have any information? Does any agency have any information, or even the community's public works department? Did you look everywhere you could look? And so in many cases, if someone is applying for a LOMA in an unnumbered A zone and they'd like FEMA to reply back with a BFE, if they certify or state that they have sought that information from all of these other sources and no one had it, frequently FEMA will give a BFE for that site on the letter of map amendment determination letter that they produce at the end. I don't know if John or someone from FEMA would want to say more about that. They don't always give a BFE, but I know that when people ask, very often they can get one. Did you want to do questions at this point, Shannon? Or?
Yeah. Thank you, Joy and Shannon. I'll leave it up to you here. I don't see any questions, but we'll ask for questions now.
Right. So if you do have any, feel free to put them in the Q&A or the chat.
Yeah. And if no one does, this is where Eric picks up. And Eric, I'll advance the slides for you. Just poke me. Okay.
Okay, Joy, here I am, and I just want to stay on this slide for a little bit. I'll be talking about letters of map revision based on fill, both the letter of map revision based on fill and the conditional letter of map revision based on fill. And I just want to make an important distinction between the two of them. The letter of map revision based on fill actually removes something from the floodplain based on placement of fill, like the name would imply. The conditional letter of map revision based on fill does not. The conditional letter of map revision based on fill is a comment document from FEMA that says they would remove something from the floodplain based on the placement of fill if the fill is placed and the rest of the work is done as it was proposed in the application. So it's important to remember that if a conditional letter of map revision based on fill is granted by FEMA, that has to be followed up with an actual letter of map revision based on fill to actually remove something from the floodplain. So that's all I wanted to say on this slide. Joy, can you advance to the next, please? Okay, like I said before, somebody can place fill on their property, and this can result in removal from the floodplain if a number of conditions are met. Like Joy said about letters of map revision, communities are going to be aware that this is taking place. So there are forms that have to be signed by the community. And there are certain certifications that are required from the community, and I will get into that. The application package, the application that's used is the MT1 application. So keep that in mind. You would not use an MT2 or an MTEZ. It's the MT1 package. FEMA will review this and issue as appropriate, like I said, if the criteria are met that are outlined in that MT1 application package. And removal from the floodplain can eliminate the requirement to carry flood insurance. Of course, a person can still carry flood insurance if they choose at a reduced premium, like it says there on the slide. Next slide, please, Joy. Joy?
Yep, I hear you. I'm just, my screen seems to be frozen a little bit here. Uh-oh.
Okay.
Let's see. don't really know what this is, but hang in there.
Yep, I'm still here.
Okay, is that it?
That's the one.
All right.
Okay, so like I said before, the community will be reviewing this before it goes to FEMA because no application package will be processed without this form signed by the community. It is the community acknowledgement form. It is, again, like the name implies, the community is acknowledging that they are aware of this application and they are certifying some things that FEMA will need to have certified. As it says here on the slide, there are two sections to this form. The one that's used for the letter map revision based on fill or the conditional is Part A, applications that involve placement of fill. Part B, I'm not going to be covering today. That would be for removal of a property that's located within the regulatory floodway. And that just reminds me of something. This process can only be used in A zones. This can't be used in a V zone. And this cannot be used for removal from a floodway. You cannot remove a property from the floodplain if that property is also located in a floodway. So it has to be in an A zone and it has to not be in a floodway. So Part A, we're going to take a look at Part A and see what FEMA is asking the community to be certifying. So next slide, please, Joy. This is not the whole Section A. This is just the first part of Section A. And I made it a little bit bigger so you can read it because I don't think you would have been able to on the previous slide. So you can take a look at this. You can read it if you want. I'll just kind of hit the highlights. What it's saying here is that the community is certifying, and somebody's going to be signing this, somebody from the community will be signing this, that the completed or proposed project meets or is designed to meet all of the community's floodplain management requirements. Like I said, including the requirement that fill is not placed in a floodway. Also, all other permits, federal, state, that are applicable have been permitted or will be obtained. So that's the first part of that certification. And while I'm on the subject, question I get a lot is, who actually signs this? That's a good question. Now, communities should have somebody who has the title of floodplain administrator. Some communities might not have somebody designated. And I get questions from communities frequently. Who's the floodplain administrator? Communities should have somebody designated. If they don't, they will soon, because we are now requiring that be in the local regulations. So somebody at the community is going to be the floodplain administrator, and maybe they're the ones who signs this, or maybe that particular task is delegated to somebody else in the community. But this could be one of the functions of the floodplain administrator. In any event, the person reviewing this and certifying the things that I'm talking about, it's important that that person, if that person isn't also the building inspector, that person should be coordinating this and making this this information available to the building inspector, because eventually a building permit's going to be issued, presumably. So if they're not the same person, those people should be coordinating with each other, and it's important that documentation be kept of this, just so that everyone knows what's going on. Next slide, please. So I talked about a little bit this already. Part A, and I haven't covered all of Part A yet, but in Part A, the community official is reviewing this to make sure that it's not in a regulatory floodway. It meets all of the community requirements, and it has or will have all necessary permits. Next slide, please. This is not the rest of section A. This is towards the bottom of section A. I'm skipping over part of what's in there. There's a part in section A that addresses the Endangered Species Act. So when if you're the one in your community who reviews this, when you're looking at this, make sure you're reading the whole thing and not just looking at these two pieces I'm talking about today. But this is important. It's all important, of course, but this is towards the bottom of that part A on the community acknowledgement form. And here we're saying we've determined that the land or any existing structure are or will be reasonably safe from flooding as defined in the CFR, and that we have this documentation available on request. So reasonably safe from flooding, that's an important thing to be considering. The community official signing this form is certifying that the fill and structures placed on the fill are or will be reasonably safe from flooding. Next slide, please, Troy. So just to recap the two different sections we just looked at. Meets all requirements, has all the permits, not in the floodway, and it's reasonably safe from flooding. Next slide, please. So we covered that already. So on to the next slide again. Technical Bulletin 10, just in case you were wondering what it means to be reasonably safe from flooding, FEMA has put together Technical Bulletin 10 to explain in a lot of detail what exactly that means. And this is especially important for structures. In fact, you see that right in the title, ensuring that structures built on fill in the special flood hazard area are reasonably safe from flooding. So there's a lot of different ways that a structure can be considered reasonably safe from flooding. I'm not going to go over every single example that's in the technical bulletin. I actually read these technical bulletins, and I recommend to people that they read the technical bulletins because I think they're very good and they provide very clear guidance on these different topics. Not everyone does read them, but that's okay because I do, and I'll explain to you the stuff in there that's important to this particular topic. And I'm going to start just by going over a few of the ways that a structure can be considered to be reasonably safe from flooding. Next slide, please, Troy. Okay, this is actually the example that FEMA considers to be the most reasonably safe from flooding. So this is the best option, and it says that in the technical bulletin. And this is the, you can see in the picture that compacted fill has been placed to an elevation above the base flood elevation. The house is built on top of that fill, and you have solid foundation walls. The foundation walls are backfilled with compacted fill, and the lowest floor is at an elevation that's above the base flood elevation. So this does not have a basement. This structure does not have a basement, and the lowest floor is above the base flood elevation. So even without the placement of fill here, this structure would be compliant with the A zone standards that would be applicable for a structure in the floodplain, even without being removed from the floodplain. The whole point of this process is to remove the structure and the property or part of the property from the floodplain, but this would be an A zone compliant structure nonetheless. Next slide, please. Okay, so this one FEMA considers to be still pretty good, not as good as the previous example, but still reasonably safe from flooding. Again, you have your compacted fill placed to an elevation above the base flood elevation. You have solid wall foundations. They're not backfilled this time, so you have a crawl space with hydrostatic openings, and your lowest floor is at or above the base flood elevation. Again, this structure is compliant with the A zone, again, regardless of whether it receives the letter of map revision based on fill. This is a compliant structure. Next, please. Okay, slab on grade. Again, you have your compacted fill placed to an elevation above the base flood elevation, and this time you have a slab on grade. So your lowest floor is at or above the base flood elevation. Again, this is compliant. This is a compliant structure, compliant with the A-zone standards, FEMA's A-zone standards. Massachusetts, of course, does require a 1 foot of freeboard, but this would be A-zone compliant structure. Next, please. Okay, so here's the first one that has a basement, but in this case, you have compacted fill, and the fill is placed to an elevation that's above the base flood elevation, but you have a basement. In this case, your basement floor is above the base flood elevation. Again, so this and all of the previous examples are examples of structures that are compliant with the A-zone elevation. They're all considered to be reasonably safe from flooding. Now, not every structure has to be compliant with the A-zone standards, but I bring this up for one thing. I bring it up because it's all in the technical bulletin and it's all important information, but it's good to remember that even if a structure is removed by letter of map revision based on fill, there will still be residual flood risks, and it might be a really good idea to have a structure that is compliant with the underlying A zone, even if it is removed from the floodplain. So here you have a basement, but the basement floor is above the base flood elevation. So I've got one more example. Next slide, please. And I'm not using every single example from the technical bulletin. So if you want to look at more stuff, I always encourage people to read the technical bulletins. But here is the last example I'm going to use for this presentation. And this is kind of it's the most important one because it's the one that we seem to have problems with. We've had some problems with this process. So here you have your fill, which is compacted, and the fill is placed to a level which is at or above the base flood elevation, but you also have a basement, and your basement floor is below the base flood elevation. So this is not automatically considered to be reasonably safe from flooding. Technical Bulletin 10 has a couple of different methods for determining whether this kind of design is reasonably safe from flooding. One is called the simplified method, which I will cover today, and one is called the engineered basement option. I'm not going to cover that a lot today. Sometimes I refer to that as the complicated method as opposed to the simplified method. So I will talk a little bit about the simplified method that you will find in Technical Bulletin 10. It's the one that most people use, and it's the easiest one to understand. So if you go to the next slide, please, Joy, I'll talk just a little bit about the simplified approach, simplified method. It has a whole list of stuff that has to be met in order to use this simplified method, and I'll just touch on a couple of them here. Ground surface around the building within a defined setback has to be at or above the base flood elevation. That's the first bullet there. That setback has to be a minimum of 20 feet. So 20 feet around the building, that ground elevation after filling has to be at or above the base flood elevation. The ground has to be compacted fill. It has to meet compaction requirements. I won't read them all. And that has to extend at least 5 feet below the bottom of that basement slab. I'm going to skip down a couple and mention that the elevation of the basement floor should be no more than 5 feet below the base flood elevation. And here's another one. It has to have a sump pump. It has to have a sump pump, and it has specification there, 1/4 horsepower sump pump with a backup power supply. Okay, so there's a lot of things that have to be met here in order to have something considered to be reasonably safe from flooding if it has a basement and that basement floor is below the base flood elevation. Now, when people talk to me about they want to use this process and they're asking me for my advice, I always tell them that the best approach is to design and build a structure that meets the A-zone requirements, because that will be considered reasonably safe from flooding. The 4 different examples I showed you of structures that meet the A-zone requirements, those would all be considered reasonably safe from flooding. A structure with a basement would have to either meet the criteria that are detailed here in this simplified method, or they would have to use the engineered basement option, which is not nearly as simple as this one. So if you can go to the next slide, please, Joy. So what can happen? What can happen and what has happened when this process doesn't work the way it's supposed to work? This has happened. People will apply for a conditional letter of map revision based on fill. They will submit that application to FEMA. The application clearly states that they are proposing to place fill and construct a building. Their application might include an elevation certificate based on construction drawing, which says how that building's going to be built. But when FEMA, unfortunately, when FEMA reviews conditional letters of map revision based on fill request, they're not looking at the building. They're looking at the fill, and they provide comments based on the placement of that fill, whether this property or the portion of this property will be removed from the floodplain, and they're not saying whether or not that building will be removed from the floodplain. So this can be very confusing to an applicant or a community. So that's why we do this training, by the way. We want to make sure that communities understand the process and understand what needs to be looked at when reviewing that reviewing and signing and certifying that community acknowledgement form, when they're saying that something is or will be reasonably safe from flooding, what that means. And what I tell communities is, if they're reviewing an application which is for placement of fill and construction of a building, they should be requiring certification that the criteria in technical bulletin 10 are met, if it has a basement, mind you, if it has a basement and that basement floor is below the base flood elevation, either the simplified approach or the engineered basement option should be used, and certification should be in hand that the design meets one of those methods. Either that or the building is designed to meet A-zone standards. Because if that building does not, what can happen? Next slide, please. Next slide will tell you when the applicant goes to apply for the as-built letter of map revision based on fill, if that building doesn't meet what's described in technical bulletin 10, then not only will the letter of map revision based on fill be denied, but the building will be identified as a violation of FEMA standards for construction in an A zone. So we're trying very much to avoid that happening. It's important that the person signing the community acknowledgement form understands that and is requiring that documentation. It's important that if that person isn't the building inspector, then that person provides that information to the building inspector and keep something on file. We've had a couple situations where one person signs the community acknowledgement form and then retires or leaves and goes to work in another town. And then the new guy doesn't know anything about it, so doesn't know what's been reviewed or what's been signed. And unfortunately, that's the kind of thing that can lead to this sort of problem. I know that FEMA Region 1 has also spoken to FEMA about improving the process on FEMA's end, because frankly, I find it a little hard to believe that FEMA would receive an application that has details about the proposed building and yet still issue a conditional letter of map revision based on fill, when the information supplied in the application would indicate that the structure would be non-compliant. That shouldn't happen either. But what we can control is what happens on the community end, and that's during the review process, when that community acknowledgement form is being reviewed and signed and certified. Certification from a design professional is obtained at that point, that certifies that technical bulletin 10 is being met for a structure that has a basement floor that's below the base flood elevation.
Eric, I just
Okay.
want to, just for clarification, are you saying that buildings are being denied even if they follow the engineered or simple or complicated method as part of the application as well?
No.
Okay.
What the ones that are being denied are buildings that do not meet either the simplified or the engineered basement option,
Gotcha.
the
Okay.
complicated method, because unfortunately that wasn't part of the review and the first part of the process.
It wasn't communicated that that needed to be part of that process.
Exactly. That's
Gotcha.
what we're trying to do today.
Awesome.
Okay. Let's see. Next slide, please. So here is a table that kind of has in tabular form some of the things that I've talked about and a lot of the different ways that a structure can be built. I don't know about everyone else, but I can't actually see the bottom of the table, but the darker shaded part of the table is the reasonably safe from flooding part of the table. So that would include the structures that meet A-zone standards anyway. The bottom part or lighter shaded part of the table would include some of the design and construction methods, which would include the basement, which is below grade or below the base flood elevation. So those aren't automatically reasonably safe from flooding. And if you read the bottom of the table, which I can't see, unfortunately, on my version of on my screen, the bottom says, the lighter gray shaded says, follow the guidance and technical bulletin 10 to ensure that these things are reasonably safe from flooding. So that is pretty much kind of what I already talked about, but you see it in table form here. So I got one more slide, actually maybe two. Next slide, please, Joy. Okay, just to sum it up. So certification is required during the first part of this process when somebody from the community is looking at reviewing, signing and certifying the community acknowledgement form. Unless the building proposed meets A-zone standards, without removal from the A-zone, unless it meets A-zone standards, you should have certification from the appropriate professional that it meets technical bulletin 10, the guidance in technical bulletin 10. So the local official signing that form should require that certification and make sure they keep documentation in a file somewhere, and make sure if it's not the building department who's signing the form, make sure that's shared with the building department so they know about it. And let's see, down at the bottom, professional engineer, professional geologist, professional soil scientists. The geologist and the soil scientist, they might get involved when they do the engineered basement option because they have to look at soil types and how the water flows through. And the little picture there looks like a welder to me. So, but I don't think they're implying that you should get a welder to certify that that technical bulletin 10 is met, but you have the appropriate professional provide that certification as part of that original review and signing of the community acknowledgement form. And later on, when the building department is reviewing and issuing the building permit, they should also make sure that that documentation is on hand. So you're checking things at two different ends at the community level, regardless of what FEMA does on their level. This should make sure that we don't have any more of the kinds of problems that we've had with this process. And I think my next slide is just a request, if anyone has questions.
All right, thank you, Eric. We do have a couple of questions.
All right.
So the first one, and if you covered these, if we can just clarify them again.
Okay.
Why do you need the vents on crawl space construction if the fill level is at or above the base flood elevation?
I think building code would not require it. So I don't think, well, building code requirement in Massachusetts, because we have 1 foot of freeboard, you would need them at least up to that base flood elevation +1. I think they're shown there in the examples as kind of like a best practice, like, hey, what if we get a flood that's 2 feet higher than the base flood elevation? It's not impossible. So I think it's just an extra added design feature for extra protection.
Great, thank you. And can you talk about how this affects the building permit process with the CLOMRF and then the documentation and LOMRF?
Okay, let's see. If a building department were to receive a building permit application for construction of a house that does not meet the A zone standards for the underlying A zone, but the applicant has a conditional letter of map revision based on fill issued by FEMA, the building department should make sure that they have technical bulletin 10 certification, certification from a design professional saying that the building is designed to meet either the simplified approach or the engineered basement option described in technical bulletin 10. I would advise against issuing a building permit without that, because if the design does not meet the underlying A zone standards, then you have no assurance that this would be removed from the floodplain during the as-built letter of map revision based on fill process without that documentation.
Thank you, Eric. We have no more questions at this moment, but I would like to give FEMA an opportunity to offer any additional comments.
Sure, Shannon, I actually, since we have a little extra time, I have about 3 questions for.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I figured I'd be able to, we have a little extra time or else I wouldn't throw these out there. But I do have a few questions. On technical bulletin 10, understanding that there's a difference obviously in residential and commercial construction, is that geared more or exclusively to residential construction, Eric?
All of the examples look like residential buildings, but I think it could be used for either. I don't see any reason why it couldn't be used for non-residential construction.
Hey, Joe, can I jump in? I see that one of our previous question askers has raised his hand. So
okay.
To follow up, I assume. So Nick, I am going to allow you to talk. If that doesn't work, feel free to type in the chat.
Hi, thank you, Shannon. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
Hi, this is Nick Mayo. I'm the building commissioner in the town of Dennis, and I appreciate the training you guys are doing, and Eric's provided a lot of good information. I'm still a little hung up on what I see as a little bit of a technicality issue, and I'm just curious if there's been any insight from the BBRS or even from FEMA about this. Is when we get a building permit application in that has even if there's a conditional approval based on fill, provided with that, and it's compliant with Technical Bulletin 10, unless I'm understanding this incorrectly, technically it's still not compliant with the building code, and I would not be able to issue a building permit if the building is not compliant with that flood hazard area, in this case, an A zone. So how is that supposed to be managed? Because the property and the structure has not technically been actually removed from the flood hazard area.
You are correct.
So
The conditional letter of map revision based on fill, you're correct, does not remove the property or anything else from the floodplain, but it is supposed to be an assurance to you that if it's built as proposed, it will be removed from the A zone. I have not run this by the BBRS, so I don't know what they would say about that. What I would recommend here is maybe we should have thought of this before and started this conversation, but I would recommend that you bring this up with your state inspector, and I'd be more than happy to be part of that conversation.
Understood. I appreciate that, because if you read the building code, it does tell you that the building officials are basically prohibited from allowing any kind of variance with flood regulations at all. It's the
That is
BBRS
correct.
to do that. So in my experience with FEMA, my limited experience, they're very big on technicalities. So how is that supposed to look on the community if they're issuing permits in this fashion, you know?
This is a process which is approved by FEMA, so I think I think FEMA would be okay with a community issuing a permit under this set of circumstances, but it's probably a good idea that we get a procedure in place with the BBRS so that it works better and with everybody's approval.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Eric. Since we have FEMA with us here, do any of you who are with us want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, my biggest concerns with this type of development is that I've seen a lot of local communities just accept the Clomar F as a done deal, the Clomar is conditional, when they issue the permit then, and then we see the Lomar F with a structure with a basement, we end up with a violation. And so what we would ask the communities in the permitting process is, if the homeowner, the applicant, has a Clomar F that proposes a basement with fill, is that the technical bulletin 10 information is submitted with the application for the permit initially, so that the town can know that the plans are for TB10. And then when the final Lomar F is submitted to remove the structure, if it has a basement, that the final TB10 documentation is stamped and on file at the local community, because it'll come across our desks as a potential violation, and we will have to reach out to the community and say, do you have TB10 documentation? You say, yes, here we have it. And then we can clear that PV right away to clear the potential violation. We can clear it right away to clear it with the community and the map reviewers. So the process then also, if you have a person removing an area without building a structure at the same time, and then later builds a structure on that filled area, we would also request that you have that TB10 documentation on file, but FEMA's not going to come asking for it in that situation. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Molly.
Yes, and I'd like to comment on that as well. That the conditional letters of map revision based on fill are FEMA's comments. They're not approvals to start work. So the community still needs to do their due diligence to make sure that the homeowner or the builder is making sure that it is reasonably safe from flooding, which includes technical bulletin 10 if you have a basement. So so FEMA is not necessarily going to be looking for that or commenting on that during the conditional part, but you are always welcome to reach out to us in the region to ask us questions if you're ever unsure about anything on these. But FEMA does not issue permits or approvals to start work. So you still do have to look and make sure that they're following all of the local state and FEMA regulations. And I also want to comment that a CLOM-RF is based on the condition of the site at the time of the application. So if there's been some time passed, or if their plans end up differing from what they have submitted to FEMA, then the conditional letter of map revision is really not valid. So that's another thing to watch out for as well.
Thank you. And I do have just a couple follow-up questions in regards to what we just talked about here, which is what, we get this question all the time in the world of, a homeowner that gets an elevation certificate and they see that the lowest grade's about a foot away from them getting a LOMA. So what is the threshold, if there is one, that we're using that will designate work between a LOMA where somebody brings in fill around the existing structure to elevate the land and going for a letter of map revision based on fill where a structure might be elevated on? Is there a threshold we're looking for there? So basically an existing structure where the homeowner brings in a certain amount of fill to get a LOMA versus going for the letter of map revision based on fill or any other of the letter of map changes.
You cannot bring in any fill at all to get a LOMA. Zero
Right.
fill. Zero. None.
If you're bringing fill in, you have to be using the letter of map revision based on fill process.
Yep. And we just get, I bring that up because that's a question we all get, I'm sure, at some point about a homeowner that's looking at his or her property saying, hey, we've got a little bit to go until we can get out. And next thing you know, there's a truck coming in with 5 yards, 10 yards of fill. And it's always a question that we get. And that's exactly what I was hoping that we would get a resounding no on, because that's exactly what we tell people as well, is don't start bringing in fill, because not only will your neighbors not like you, neither will the community. So great. And then the other question,
Joe, can I continue on that a little bit
sure.
too?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, if you bring in fill and you have a basement in an existing structure, you're gonna get pinged through this process as well. So even if you bring in fill on an existing structure and submit the correct documentation, a LOMR-F, if you have a basement, you're not necessarily a violation, but you're also not going to be removed from the SFHA without meeting technical bulletin 10. Retrofitting the technical bulletin 10 is very difficult. It's possible, but very difficult. So it's not that the fill placement itself is a violation and your structure itself is not a violation. But bringing fill in on an existing structure is not going to get you removed from the SFHA if you have a basement.
Awesome. Okay, great. Good. That's a good clarification. That retrofit piece is exactly the term that I was looking for there. And then the other question I had is, can a community deny a community the community acknowledgement form?
I would say if the community has something in their local regulation that does not allow this to happen, then I would say the community can do that.
Eric, could they not also do that if they were uncomfortable with the documentation that they've been given?
Good point. They absolutely should not ever sign something if they're not comfortable with the documentation that's been provided to them.
Great. And then the last question I had, which will hopefully not confuse things more, and I'm hoping it ties this all together, is the process that we've obviously heard of when fill is brought in and then that lot of land is removed before any work is done or any proposed work is done. What's your guidance or suggestions around doing that type of work?
Okay, I have suggestions. I think what you're describing here is somebody brings fill in, places the fill, gets a letter of map revision based on fill, removes that property from the floodplain. Now they're not in the floodplain. So do the floodplain standards apply or not? I say they do not. However, I have plenty of guidance and recommendation. I would treat that the same way as I would treat everything that I described today. There's residual flood risk. You should design a structure My first recommendation would be to meet the underlying A-zone standards. That would be my first recommendation. And if not, I would then recommend that you design and build that structure to meet the guidelines that are described in Technical Bulletin 10 for a structure with a basement.
Great.
And in support of that, like I said before, FEMA's not gonna catch that through the letter of map review process. But in order for community liability to show that they're enforcing consistently from project to project, both of those situations with the basement should have Technical Bulletin 10 or similar documentation on file, so that nobody can come back to the local community and say, you treated me differently because I did the process differently. We need to treat everybody the same, even though they go through the FEMA pipeline slightly differently.
Great. Okay, cool. Any other questions from anybody? I've exhausted mine, so thank you, everyone. I figured we get some good conversation going with those. Any other questions?
I see no more in the chat or Q&A. But remember, folks, there is a raise hand function if you want to ask your question verbally.
Yes, and so because we have, well, we're going to go into our next section, but because we have just a slight little bit extra time, we will, as we go through, go back and make sure we answer those. Okay, so right before, one moment here, let me get to our next section. Okay, just a couple housekeeping things as we end that first part of the presentation, or the training part of our meeting, that this qualifies for 1 CBO credit and 1 CFM credit. So make sure everybody here will be tracked and sent to Shannon, who will be applying those application for credits. And then if you are on the phone, like we said earlier, make sure that you let us know that you attended today, either after this by emailing us or chatting us, and we will make sure you're added to that submission.
And Joe, I'll also add to that because the training portion of this meeting is done, if you were here to get your credit, you may leave at this point and you will still get your credit. But we definitely have some good information about the CRS coming up.
Yes, we encourage you to stay as we're getting into our next section here, and the slides. Also, Eric and Joy, we will talk about sharing slides. I'm guessing that we're okay with that, or we'll talk about that.
Yeah, I'll make a PDF of the slides and send it to you.
Awesome.
Okay.
Very good, and we'll distribute that. Great. Now, our next part of the day of our meeting is now going to move into updates with CRS, which is why we suggested that everybody stay. We're going to be getting an update from Eugene Coles, who is our ISO specialist. So with that, Gene, thank you for being here.
Yeah, good morning. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I've been having some technical issues here, so hopefully you'll be able to hear me throughout. And if you can't, just let me know. Thanks, Joy and Eric, for a wonderful presentation. As a former LOMA analyst that has processed probably about 1,500 LOMAs, yeah, it almost kind of brought back some nightmares. But yeah, the one thing I want to say too, that Eric mentioned about that community acknowledgement form, please, please, please make sure that you look at the project before you sign that, because I ran into quite a few problems with that. And some of the LOMRFs that I processed back in the day. And also I want to thank Shannon and Joe for putting this together, because this is a very timely opportunity, because recertifications are coming up here in a few days. You'll be getting your recertification material from Melissa James. She is still the resource specialist for Massachusetts. I'm the field representative. She's the resource specialist that's going to be handling all the elevation certificates and recertifications. We also hired another resource specialist, and there's some changes with territories, but for now, Melissa is still going to be the resource specialist. And I think she'll probably be sending that material out either at the end of this week or the beginning of next week. And there've been a few changes to the process and how it's going to work, especially for communities that are in different levels of review. So either you're going to get a full recertification, you're going to get a partial recertification where you're just going to submit elevation certificates, and that's primarily for those folks that are going to be having a cycle this year. I think we just have 4, if memory serves me correct. There's just 4 communities that are having a cycle this year. And then there's communities that are currently in a cycle, and you will get a letter, email from Melissa, and everything is going to be explained in that email. So please be sure to read the entire email, because it gives a good rundown of exactly what you're going to need to provide to her. And she does a really good job in getting back with everybody when, you know, something is amiss. Another thing to remember is you need to have your elevation certificates correct. It's not going to be a situation where we gather them every 5 years, look at them, and then you have to get them correct. No, they're going to be reviewed every year at recertification time, and you must meet that 90% correctness threshold to remain in the program. So please be sure that you review those elevation certificates, your V-zone certificates, all construction certificates, and make sure that they're correct before you submit them. So instead of getting credit now for specific certificates, you are going to get credit for construction certificate management procedure. And we have a template for it. And I like to say it's really an enhanced standard operating procedure that most of you folks that are in the program have already completed the standard operating procedure. It just goes into more detail about what is needed with your process. And like I said, we have a template. The template's on the resource.org, crsresources.org webpage. And if you want to get that, but I'll be sure to send it to everyone when their cycle's coming around. And it really goes into what certificates are required, when the certificates are required, what department collects them, reviews them, and how they're corrected, maintained, and made available to the public. That's the basic rundown. It's mainly 2 paragraphs per section, but if you have any questions about that, please let me know. I think Northampton, granted they're out in the western part, they have submitted their CCMP for review, and they did a good job with it. It's really mainly, you know, filling in the blanks, going through your procedures and making sure that everything's in line. And this is where you're going to get your credit moving forward. You're going to get the 38 points for that CCMP. You just want to make sure that you hang on to that document, update it accordingly. If there's, you know, a changeover, new people come in, you know, make sure that your building officials have a copy of it if those are the folks that are actually reviewing the elevation certificates. Do you want to, if there's any questions now, or do you want to wait till the end?
I don't see any questions now, but
Okay.
folks feel free to send them in if you have them.
Okay. That is the main portion for elevation certificates, construction certificates moving forward. And if, like you say, if you have any questions, please let me know. And also let Melissa know. She's a very good resource in working through the process. The next update, so we're basically going through the 2021 addendum to the coordinator's manual. The coordinator's manual in and of itself hasn't changed, but we have a 2021 addendum. There's some new things that are taking place, and this is kind of what we're going to go through, what we're going through right now. The Class 8 prerequisite is for freeboard. And I know that Massachusetts has covered that in their building code and everything, and the elevation of utilities is also included with that. So we're going to be looking at not only finished floor, but also to make sure that the utilities are elevated. When we do that through the elevation certificate, we review the elevation certificates to make sure that you are meeting the freeboard requirements. And so now more than ever, those elevation certificates are extremely important, not only for your Class 9 prerequisite, but also for the Class 8 prerequisite, to show that you are enforcing the freeboard requirements. We just had some training last week, and one thing that came up in that FEMA has a document. So if you're worried about utilities, mechanicals, and things like that, FEMA has a document, FEMA P348, which goes into a lot of detail about utilities and when they're required to be elevated and what you can do to make sure that you're meeting all the requirements. Let's see. So that covers all the activities with the prerequisites. The remaining portions are actual activities where you can get some additional credit. Activity 370, flood insurance promotion, there's some new sub-elements within that activity. Most of them need for the community to be receiving activity 370 CP coverage plan credit and coverage plan implementation credit. I need to look at that and make sure that you're meeting all those, I hate to say prerequisites, but requirements to actually get that additional credit. Flood insurance brochure, flood insurance meeting, and state required continuing education credit. I think I hit those. So if you have any questions about that, please be sure to let me know.
Jean, we've got one question,
Okay.
clarification that the mechanicals also need to meet freeboard.
Yes.
Yeah,
Was-
that's in the building code now. I think that was corrected with the latest iteration,
Right.
and that is what the CRS program requires.
Right. And yeah, if you have any questions about that, please be sure to let us know before you submit the elevation certificates if you're running into some problems, because it's better to take care of it now than to wait to submit them and find out that they're wrong.
And so if folks want to, Annie, since you asked that question, if there are any follow-ups, if you want to raise your hand, we can unmute you if you want to clarify, like Nick did with his question before. And we can also talk about it offline later. Go ahead, Jean.
Great, thank you. So one other thing, the only credit that's went away is state mandated standards credit. And activity 430, that credit is being sunsetted. It really wasn't anything that communities were providing. It was one of those things where we looked at whether you had enforced building code, local drainage protection, things like that. There was just a little added credit added into your score. So most communities, it was maybe 10 points, I think, maximum. So you're probably not going to see a huge change in overall scores with that going away. Activity 450, stormwater management regulations. There's a new checklist for that. It's going to require communities to basically provide the same information, but it's in a little different format. It's going to be, I think, a little more user-friendly, and also the community should be able to maybe cut and paste some things into the checklist that'll make it a little easier for the reviewer to go through them to find that information. Also, they're moving away from the entire watershed review to a more specific locale watershed review. I think that's probably, at the end of the day, for most communities that actually get stormwater management regulation credit, will improve their score somewhat. You know, it's not going to be that minimum score that was either 0.25 or 0.50 of the total regulations. That's going to be 1.0 now. So I think for those folks that are getting credit, look forward to maybe some enhanced credit in those areas. Activity 510, there's a few new changes there. There's a new floodplain species assessment, and there's actually going to be some training on that a week from today at 1 o'clock. If you go to the crsresources.org webpage and you go to the training tab at the very end of that page, if you scroll down, you can sign up for that. It's a 1-hour training about that new sub-element or the element within activity 510. And then we have substantial damage plan. That's another new addition to the 2021 addendum. And it's going to be, it's a 6-step plan. To me, it's a very similar to a repetitive loss area analysis as far as the steps go and how many steps that you need to complete that. And I don't know if Molly, if you want to say anything about that. I know you've been an integral part of putting that together.
Yeah, so there's actually 2 CRS meetings tomorrow, also New Hampshire and Rhode Island are meeting, and I'm gonna do a 10 to 15 minute talk about the substantial damage management plan, but they're planning on using Paul Osmond, who's the former state NFIP coordinator for Illinois, is going to be the reviewer of these types of plans when they're submitted to ISO. And he's willing to also do a more extended conversation if you guys want to schedule that for a future event. But I will say, you know, substantial damage determinations are required after any impacts to any structures from any source. But what CRS is aiming to do is to reward people who plan ahead for these substantial damage missions. I think there's still a lot going on in the FEMA world with substantial damage, not only in CRS, but how we handle our post-disaster operations. There's new approvals for public assistance funding to support substantial damage missions at the local level after an event. So you wouldn't need an IA declaration to have access, individual assistance declaration to have access to this type of funding. So there's a lot of movement and nothing is complete yet with all the things that are going on with substantial damage, but there's a huge focus right now at FEMA on reducing the risk to structures that are impacted by some sort of event or situation. So there's a lot going on, and CRS is a little bit ahead of the curve because it's already been incorporated into the addendum, but there's a lot of work going on in the background at FEMA at all levels about substantial damage. So it's one of my pet projects. I love it, I care for it, and I think about it a lot. So I'm happy to talk about it whenever anyone's interested, but there is a lot of work going on around substantial damage.
Yeah, thank you, Molly. I know they're working on a template to have available to folks that they're going to be able to look at that template and add information into it to, you know, make the plan credible. I know there was one small community in New York that I worked with here a while ago, and they had put together just a manual, a guide for building code officials within that county. And I sent that over to Paul, and there's a lot of good information because they were really focused on substantial damage and everything. So a lot of what information they put together, they're going to be able to use to put into a substantial damage plan. So I think this is definitely something that, you know, every community can probably do. It's not going to be just credit for large communities, because these communities in New York are super small. They're not very big at all. So I think it's definitely something to look forward to. You know, it's I think 140 points maximum. So yeah, I think it's definitely something to look forward to. And then the last thing I have on my list is we're moving away from paper. Yay. We're going to, and actually last year I didn't receive one piece of documentation amongst the, I don't know, 19 or 20 communities that I worked with in paper format. Everything was digital. So we're actually getting a new product called CRS Submit. It's still in the works. I am hoping, from what I heard, it's going to be probably available sometime, maybe this summer, fall, somewhere in there, where it's going to be a web-based program. Folks will be able to upload their material, their documentation to that. You'll have a login, and we'll look at the information. You can submit it, and it'll, you know, I'll look at it and score it accordingly. So it's one way that we're trying to improve the process as far as scoring goes, and just, you know, getting documentation to me in a way that's not so cumbersome. So we've had some, you know, pilot runs and looked at it, and I think it's going to be great. I really do. I think it's going to be a benefit for all those communities. Of course, you're not going to be required to use it, but I would definitely consider it when it becomes available. And that is all I have as far as updates.
Awesome. Thank you, Gene. This is everyone's opportunity to ask any questions for Gene. Any CRS questions, or Shannon, or anybody else on the line? Cool. Awesome. Well, that's great. Thank you so much, Gene. I can tell you that in Marshfield, we're already implementing the flood insurance outreach and brochure sections of the addendum. So it's a great opportunity to snag a couple extra points to do something easy like that. I know Shannon's working on some flood insurance related items as well, because it's, again, some areas to grab some easy points. And all the other sections look great. And I think, Shannon, we should talk about maybe having another joint meeting with on the substantial damage part of the addendum.
I agree, Joe. That sounds like a good agenda item for our next user group meeting.
And exactly. And on that, I just want to give a quick shout out. Everybody here is obviously on the email list, either mine or Shannon's. And if you're not, here's a quick way to that we've instituted on getting on one of our lists is if you go to the either email us, or we have a form right on the Massachusetts Coastal Coalition's website. If you hover over programs, you go click the CRS users group info button and put your info in. Depending on your community, either Shannon and I will get you on our lists and start to reach out. And so I want to first thank Joy, Eric, Katie, Molly, John, Jean, and everybody who attended today. Shannon, and I appreciate you working with us to get a joint meeting together. I think this is very beneficial in our digital age. Hopefully, as we get into the fall, we'll actually be able to be in person. But I want to thank everybody for being here today. Here's my contact information and Shannon's contact information. And if none of our panelists have anything else to add, I think we are all set for today. Anyone?
I'll also say if anyone has any other questions, we do have DCR and FEMA here. You have access to them right now. If there are any other broad questions, for example, a lot of you are working through bylaws right now. We can also connect you with those folks now.
Don't bring that up. I just want to say thank you for giving us time to reach out to the communities through your user group. And we're glad to do any other training that you can think of in the future that you would want from the state. That's all.
Thanks a lot, Joy.
Great, thank you. And I should note that we will be working to formulate a follow-up to this meeting in the coming weeks, and also a follow-up on when our next meeting will be, which it sounds like, since this worked out so well, that we very well could be a joint meeting again. I think it just makes right now anyways so much sense. So we've seen no other questions and no other hands being raised. I want to thank everybody again for being here. Again, this is my contact info and Shannon's. Oh, we do have one other question that just popped in. Good.
Yep. What is the recourse if the substantial improvement / substantial damage financial? Yep, good question. So what is the recourse if the information that the community receives to determine substantial improvement or substantial damage receives is suspect? That's a good general question. Any DCR? Joy?
Well, is suspect. So the community has to use the best available data that they have. If they have some data that they suspect is not true, I guess they would need to pursue that. In other words, if they are, if they're given something that's signed and stamped by a registered professional as to, let's say, cost of construction, is that registered professional suspect, or because their reputation and their licensing is all on the line if they're submitting something false. So, that's kind of been the little safety net there for that kind of thing. I'm not sure what else would be suspect. I mean, a tax assessor's record or a uniform residential appraisal are all, again, the uniform residential appraisal is also signed signed and sealed by a registered professional whose reputation is on the line there. So, I'm not sure what it is that would be suspect. I certainly have seen things that I didn't like, but they weren't off so far,
Is a community allowed to get a second opinion on that if they are uncomfortable with the first one? Might that be?
I want to hear FEMA talk about that. I would say yes, but
Yeah, so you know, what we're really making a big push for in substantial damage is there's this terrible sentence in the substantial improvement, substantial damage desk reference that says building officials can wait for people to bring in costs to repair on substantial damage. We're really advocating for floodplain administrators to go out after an event to assess the home on their own using their own assessment guidelines and making a determination at that time. So we would want the local officials who have eyes on the building and make a determination based on the best information available at the time. So they show up at the house and let's say there's 6 feet of water in it, and they can use either our substantial damage estimation software or some other means to estimate the damages to the structure and say, we believe this is substantially damaged. And then if somebody comes in and they said, oh, well, we're only spending $10,000 to repair the 6 feet of water in our home, at least you guys have pictures and knowledge of the damage that actually took place at that structure. And that's when you rely on additional information. I don't know if John Grace is going to want to weigh in on this, but you know, there's RS means. There's different ways of calculating cost per square foot using tax assessors information to know the value of the building and then maybe calculating cost per square foot from there. So there's a lot of ways to accurately make an estimate on your own. And if you feel like the contractor's estimate that has been supplied to you or the estimate that the homeowner has supplied to you, you can always ask for more detailed information. Cost of materials, cost of labor. And even if the labor or the materials are free, the cost of them still has to be included in the determination. So we can definitely talk more about that, but there are a lot of ways that you can use consistent cost estimates to contest the proposals that are submitted to you.
Thanks a lot, Molly.
Sure.
Yeah, and can I say to you, Shannon and Joe, if you're going to put on a workshop for your CRS users regarding substantial damage, you know, I understand that substantial damage has a whole process post-disaster, pre and post-disaster, and all of that. But the premise of substantial damage is that we want to take every opportunity to make a stronger, less flood risk building, okay? Please try to keep including in the conversation, unless it's a process conversation about what do you do post-disaster. But there's, I think, and I don't know if Eric would agree with me, but I come across suspected violations of substantial improvement far more than ever substantial damage. Substantial damage is somewhat rare. You got to burn the house down or have a tornado hit it or have a flood. But day after day after day, people are doing substantial improvement to their structures and local building officials are not catching it. And so, you know, don't let your opportunity go by without pushing that concept also, for sure.
Thanks, Joy.
Yeah, thank you, Joy. I'm actually, you know, I can echo, at least on the insurance side, they don't give waivers just because you, you know, substantially improved or didn't substantially improve. I'm working on one right now where they substantially improved and didn't mitigate at the same time. It causes a lot of heartache when that's figured out. So, yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And that was a great question. Any others? We have just a little bit of time left. So, okay. Well, again, I want to thank our panelists here. I want to thank FEMA for participating. And of course, I want to thank Shannon so much for working with, you know, us and everybody and having me work with her to make this happen, because it wouldn't have happened without Shannon. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks for getting us together and hosting.
Yeah. And we will do this again. Like I said, we're going to have some conversations. We'll send out a follow-up email. We've been sending out a survey, so please, we'll send a survey out at the same time we send out the slides or a link to a survey to just get your feedback. And I will be sending over attendee list to Shannon for your credits. And again, thank you, everyone. And we will talk soon. Thank you again.
Thanks all.
Thank you.